Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. On December the 19th, the Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, was shot and killed at an art gallery in Ankara. A few hours later, a truck sped into a crowded Christmas market in Berlin, leaving at least 12 people dead and 48 injured. How will the assassination of the Russian ambassador affect relations between Russia and Turkey? Will the Berlin lorry attack change Angela Merkel's welcoming policy towards refugees? And what will be the ongoing significance of political reactions to the tragic incidents? To discuss these issues and more, today I'm glad to be joined in the studio by Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Anna Tangen, author and columnist. Osman Eral, postdoctoral fellow at Faculty of Journalism and Communication of Peking University, will join us by telephone, and Professor Zhuv Toka from the American Graduate School in Paris will also join the discussion via satellite. But before we get started, let's look at this.
The attack took place in Ankara at the Contemporary Art Gallery as the Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was delivering a speech. He was shot from behind by a lone gunman. The Turkish Interior Minister disclosed details about the gunman.
Saldırgan 24 Haziran.
The attacker was born 1994 in Aydın, Turkey. He registered at Manisa, graduated from Suke Anatolian High School, and Rüştü Unsal Police Academy, and Mevlut Mut Altintaş had been working at Ankara Riot Police for 2.5 years.
It's still not clear if he had links to any group. The gunman had managed to enter the gallery with his police identification, though he was off duty at the time of the attack. Shortly after, Turkish special forces killed the attacker. The attack came a day before the foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey and Iran met in Moscow to discuss the latest evacuation efforts in Aleppo, Syria.
The committed crime is obviously a provocation designed to spoil normalization of Russia-Turkey relations and derailing peace process in Syria, which is actively promoted by Russia, Turkey, Iran and other countries interested in reconciliation of inter-Syria conflict.
Russian President Putin added the only response to the murder is to step up the fight against terror. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke on the phone with President Putin and they pledged to cooperate.
The Russian authorities said it's better to join the ongoing investigation with their officials, and we said there isn't any problem from our side to help out with this investigation.
The attack has been condemned by the international community and raised issues over global security. Would the diplomats' killing stain Russia-Turkey relations or spur the two countries to fight terrorism closer together?
First and foremost, who will benefit from the political assassination?
Exactly. Now it looks like if we find some, truth from this, especially assassination itself, it looks like some, especially opposition facts in Syria or some, we call it a terrorism organization. It looks like they want to get something from this assassination. But now the question is, because happened in a public venue and it was live shoot by the video. So now the question is, now it looks like international community at this moment, I mean Russia, Turkey and the European Union and United States, it looks like they have a joint ground to say something no to this incident. So I think that now perhaps it will be out of the purpose.
Despite the immediate measured response from Russian President Vladimir Putin towards the assassination, public reactions from Russia were very strong, very suspicious, very skeptical about, for example, the alleged involvement of those who were involved in the attempted coup, or it could have a close relationship with NATO. What do you think of the Russian response?
Well, like all terrorist incidents, there's this desire to explain it, perhaps in ways not supported by the facts. I mean, when people don't have them, they start drawing in what they have. The idea that somehow the CIA or that Britain or that NATO was involved is a little far-fetched. Quite frankly, we know quite a bit about this young man. We don't know how he was radicalized, but it's clear that he was acting in, for whatever sense, with or without the ISIS. It's just a terrible tragedy. Adding more unknown factors to this is not going to help.
Now, Professor Toka, it seems mishaps never come alone. Almost at the same time, we had the lorry attack in Berlin and gunfire in a church in Switzerland. What do you make of this big picture, broadly speaking, of terrorist attacks?
Well, the big picture, unfortunately, is with us for some while now. It's sort of an awakened sort of acceleration of these tragic, dangerous events over the last few days. But I mean, we all know, and we are fully aware of, the entire world, and specifically Europe, is aware of the fact that this is the new state, the neo-terrorism phenomena, which has been accelerated over the last 24 months or so, and has gone through a long list of destinations in Europe, France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Belgium and Denmark, and the list is not over. And so there were a few months, just a few months, less than 6 months, the recent 6 months, in which, just in terms of frequency of success, so to speak, of terrorist attacks, there was some kind of a pause. There were less victims, less accidents. Many plans of terrorist assault were indeed revealed by intelligence and security services over different European countries, and we had less victims, relatively so, over the last 6 months. But just last summer, there was a horrendous attack, as you remember, in Nice, France, with 86 people dead and over 200 injured, and then attacks over churches, and then attacks in Germany, in Bavaria. So what has happened now, a few days before the beginning of the holiday season, with the Christmas atmosphere, of course, is there to amplify and accentuate precisely what the terrorists are looking for, namely terrorizing large populations and conditioning governments.
Panic has obviously been generated as a result of the terrorist attacks in continental Europe. What do you think of the immediate response from Donald Trump, the president-elect, who said this is none other than just Islamic terrorism, without seeking sufficient evidence from the intelligence organization about the identification of the assassin? Immediately he drew the conclusion. Now, do you think Donald Trump sought to exploit what we call cultural clashes or clashes between civilizations? Look at the timing and the backdrop against which the terrorist attacks occurred in Turkey and Berlin in particular, because this is after all a Christian Christmas, and the perpetrators are said to be Muslims.
Yeah, I think the response from Mr. Trump to this accident showed its, traditional or his was still in the campaign, especially how will he do something to tougher the policy to immigration, especially facing Muslim people. So I think that it's a very, very how to say, a quick response, and to give a very, very clear message from Mr. Trump, say that he wants to have a more division between the local people and the immigration. But of course, now I think that even now for this attack in Berlin, even now ISO ISO say that okay, it's responsible. But now I think that so far it shows a very, very cautious attitude from policy from police in Germany, because now, as we know, it will become very, very complicated in Germany, because now it faces so big a problem of refugee migration. So I think that Mr. Trump will be more easier to say something. But for Chancellor Merkel, for Germany, for European countries, they could not do the same thing or same response like Ms. Trump?
Well, I see it in a little bit different terms. There's terrorists who are benefiting from creating terror, and then there are leaders who are trying to benefit from terrorism. And in this particular case, Donald Trump, I think, has used this, has seized upon this as validating his claim that he needs to get closer to Russia in order to deal with terrorism. And that, the immigration policies that he's pushing are correct, that having a Muslim things. Unfortunately, a lot of the things he's doing is pushing a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you start treating Muslims as different, as second-class citizens, you're going to radicalize more of them. And this is the great tragedy that we're facing.
Well, President Putin has sent Russian detectives to Ankara to join an investigation into the background of the assassin, a young guy who was born in 1994. Let's look at something that is taking place elsewhere. For example, the scheduled meeting between Sergei Lavrov and his Iranian and Turkish counterpart in Moscow to discuss the liberation of Aleppo, a very important strategic stronghold in the war-torn country of Syria. Now, do you think this assassination will deliver any negative impact upon a united front that's supposed to be forged, as opposed to the West-backed opposition forces in Syria?
No, and I'm quite cynical about it in the sense that it's actually strengthened it. And you have the Russians claiming that this is terrorism, or some of them saying NATO or CIA or something like this. They're playing on people's fears within their own country. And then you have in Turkey, they're saying, oh, this is a Gulenist plot. They're part of it. They did not point to ISIS initially. They said, oh, it's part of the Gulenists, he's part of that movement. So you have these things, and it's a very cynical deal to begin with. You have very different sides going at it, but the fact is that, I mean, Turkey is more concerned with, I think, the Kurds than they are with the situation in Aleppo, based on what has happened.
Thank you very much. Let me cross over to Mr. Osman Erol, a visiting scholar from Turkey with Peking University, and his major is journalism. Hello.
Hello.
How do local media look at the assassination in Turkey?
Well, most Turkish media that called the pro-government media reported that the incident was a provocation and terrorist attack. And the pro-government media has reported that this attack will not hurt Turkey-Russia relations. For example, pro-government newspaper Daily Sabah reported that Turkey-Russia described Invoi's murder as provocation, pledged to keep ties strong. And Turkish media underlined that the Karlov was the first foreign ambassador ever killed on duty in Turkey. And most of the Turkish media reported that worldwide well-known Hizmet movement or Gulen movement was behind the terrorist attack. But these accusations denied and condemned by the Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen, who is in self-exile in the United States. Gulen sent condolences to the Russia and asked the investigations to punish the people who were responsible on assassination. And the last Turkish media that opposite to government reported that ambassador's murder reflected the lack of security situation in Turkey, and the assassination would link to the al-Nusra, which is terrorist group in Syria, because of the attacker's Arabic slogan that also known as the first part of the anthem of al-Nusra. This is very important, and many believe in Turkey that this is an important indication of how the radical infiltration has found ground in the Turkish police forces after thousands of police officers were purged for their alleged link to Gulen movement. Jan-Ray?
How do you assess the consequences?
Well, I think it is important to see that the incident came right after the defeat of the jihadi groups in Syria. But I think the assassination would not hurt efforts to reach a peace deal in Syria. But at the same time, Russia will not let this go unpunished, as Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said. And I think the difficulties would ahead of Turkey after assassination. And finally, I'd like to say Turkey and Russia will continue cooperation against terror despite assassination of Ambassador Karlov. And it is early to say, Mr. Yanrei, who is behind this terrorist attack. it will be known after the investigation.
Thank you very much for being with us. That's
Pleasure.
That's a young Turkish scholar with the School of Journalism of Peking University. Welcome back. What do you think of the united front of Iran, Moscow, and Turkey in fighting the opposition forces and in supporting the Assad regime?
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Yes,
think this is the only group that can make a big difference in the battlefield of Syria?
Yes. Now, I would want to have say more about the last issue. I think that now we need to make it clear that for the politicians, for the international politics, maybe the benefits or interests always are more important than truth itself. So now, of course, now we need to take some more time to wait for the result of an investigation. But now I think that for Mr. Erdogan, for President Putin, they are so pragmatic. So before they get some conclusions, we can find out conclusions already. For example, now Mr. Erdogan pointed to Mr. Gulen in the United States, and for President Putin, perhaps now the NATO or some Western countries would be, play a role behind this assassination. So I think that now the benefits, or especially beneficial for both two countries, will be the conclusion for this investigation. And for this trilateral cooperation between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, I think now it looks like it's a very, very part for this solution in Syria issue. And also it looks like Turkey played a very, very important role. And now, as we understand, once there will be a long-term resolution for Syria issue, certainly Turkey and Iran should be inside. But now the question for NATO or for Western countries is, now Turkey want to play maybe a more neutral role between Russia, Iran, and NATO. And also, I think that Russia take the advantage or take the opportunity to get a closer cooperation with Iran and Turkey, those two important regional powers. So I think that now it looks like not only on the military ground in Aleppo and also in political and diplomatic field, Russia takes some advantage.
Thank you very much.
Cooperating with two countries.
Thanks a lot. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Anna Tangen. We are also joined by a French scholar at the American Graduate School in Paris. We're discussing the impact of a recent assassination of a Russian ambassador to Ankara, Turkey. We shall be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. What do you think of the increasing number of terrorist attacks against soft targets in the wake of 9/11, particularly after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan? More of Western tourists or passengers in the streets of whatever Western cities would easily become lorry attacks or lone wolf attacks, as we have seen in some of the European cities. What do you think of this tendency?
Yeah. I think now
Anna, perhaps you are in a position to make comments on how the United Front in the West joined hand in very strong response in the counter-terror campaign.
Well, the problem is that the terrorists are in essence winning. They're creating the kind of terror that they want, and they're doing with impunity. They've moved away from explosives, which take quite a bit of time and effort to coordinate. You have to bring them in, you have to know how to put a bomb together. Now they're improvising. They're using lorries, 86 or 12
Are you
and things.
pessimistic that we're going to have more of such terrorist attacks, and it's unpredictable, cannot be prevented in time?
No, you cannot prevent these things. Somebody was talking today, they can put up barricades around crowds, but quite frankly, if you get a bus or a heavy truck or something like that, you can do it during rush hour. There's absolutely nothing that you can do short of stopping everyone from doing anything. And this is the kind of opening that the terrorists want to get. Unfortunately, this is going to push the solution towards stamping out terrorism. The difficulty is you can kill terrorists, but you can't necessarily kill the ideals or the radicalism that they're preaching.
very much so, ideology is difficult to eradicate. Up next, let's take a quick look at what Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, has to say about the ramification of the political assassination and how they will respond to terrorist attacks in continental Europe.
There is much we still do not know with sufficient certainty, but we must, as things stand now, assume it was a terrorist attack. I know it would be especially hard for us all to bear if it were confirmed that the person who committed this act was someone who sought protection and asylum in Germany. We don't want to live with the fear of evil paralyzing us, even if that is difficult right now. We will find the force to live the life we want to live in Germany, free, together, and open.
Professor Toker, what do you think of the consequences arising from a string of terrorist attacks in Europe in particular? Do you foresee a rise of a far-right movement as evidenced by the election in France? And do you think Angela Merkel and her CDU, the ruling party in Germany, will suffer a devastating loss in the general election next year?
We are already witnessing in several West European countries, amongst them indeed Germany and France, but also Britain and Belgium and the Netherlands and others, a rise of the extreme right nationalist movements, which is to a very large extent linked to the overall sphere of problems or issues or themes, namely immigration, terrorism, frequently Islam per se is associated to that kind of reasoning and giving some kind of extra energy, if I may say so, to the type of ideologies, mainly the type of rhetorics leaders of extreme right nationalist parties in different countries, in different contexts, are exploiting, and they are exploiting them positively in the terms. If you look at the overall extreme right electoral force in Western and Central Europe, say 5 years ago or 3 years ago or just 1 year ago, and you compare them with the ratings these days, you just see that we're speaking about a climbing curve. Now, it's too early to predict whether Chancellor Merkel might lose the elections, which are going to take place only in 10, 11 months. That's a very long time in politics, all over the place, including Germany. We shouldn't forget, however, on a larger scale, that what Chancellor Merkel decided to do about 2 years ago, which ended up in welcoming about a million refugees, mostly from Middle Eastern crisis zone and war zones, was a decision which is really on the dimension of history, history with a capital H. In terms of historical reparation of Germany with its own conscience, and that was a very courageous, and stays a very courageous and exceptional decision among world leaders on any scale. Now, this is a very complicated one, and the price she will have to pay for that internally, including perhaps the perils of her chances to be re-elected for the 4th time, after all, in Germany in September. Now, in France, the case is very different. The rise of the extreme right, of course, has been reinforced due to terrorism and fear,
the rise
and the overall atmosphere which these terrorist acts dictate. So we have
the rise of the far-right movement, the rise of populism, and the general elections in Germany, France are one thing. On the one hand. On the other hand, I'm afraid, let me have your comments on the alleged demise of the European Union or the Schengen Agreement as a result of the tidal waves of asylum seekers who threaten to undermine seriously the traditional borders of nation states in the European Union. What do you think, very quickly, your comments on the future of the European Union?
Well, I think based on what you see happening. You're going to see increasingly these right-wing movements moving into power. We don't know yet what the facts are in this. This could be somebody who was in Germany, or they flew into Germany, or they could come from somewhere else. It's not necessarily, it hasn't been shown that it was a refugee. So the issue here, though, is that let's look at the overall background of this. It's probable that most of these countries will not abide by the Schengen Agreement. The irony there is that it's these Eastern European countries that were pushing for this free movement so they could get workers to areas where they could get well-paying jobs. So you have the last ones coming in being the first one to object to other people coming in. But most of these countries, I think it's inevitable, will start pushing Muslims out. First will be the refugees. Second, there will be maybe even attempts to get people who have naturalized in those areas. It's going to be a very, very difficult road. Unfortunately, a self-fulfilling tragedy.
Yeah. Let me correct a small mistake that I made in the first part of the program. There was an attack on a mosque in Switzerland, not on a church, because that's very different by nature. So what do you make of his response towards the future of the Schengen Agreement?
Yeah, it's very I think dangerous for the Schengen Agreement. Even several before, I mean, especially last year, there were bigger debate within the European Union to say, how could we protect the principle of movement of people? I think, as we know, the achievement of this principle is this Schengen Agreement. And now, because of more and more tighter and tighter, border control measures by some member states, to some degree, there is not a full Schengen Agreement already now within European Union. But now, of course, now we look at this, what will happen in Germany, because now Germany become a very, very symbolic, saying for this principle or agreement. Once there will be more tighter policy from the German government, I think that we have to say that yes, now European Union is still here. Also, we do have a Schengen Agreement, but it's different from the past.
Islamic State has claimed the responsibility for the attack in Berlin, but the perpetrator is still unknown. Is this an example of the group attempting to take credit for anything that makes it look more powerful and far-reaching, or do they know something the German authorities don't? Because we are talking about fighting ISIL, which is prioritized on the general President-elect Donald Trump, despite his very ambiguous attitude towards Moscow.
Well, it's too premature to tell right now what it is, but it's clear that between Nusra Front, between ISIS, there is a radicalization going on, and they're going to claim credit, whether it's a lone wolf attack or if it's organized. They're going to say that we radicalize these people and that we're leading this new front. So unfortunately, yes, they will continue to do this. The question is what we do going forward.
Tomorrow, a state funeral will be held to pay tribute to the fallen Russian ambassador. What do you expect Putin to say in his presentation? And later on, he's going to host a press conference, the last of its kind, by the end of this year.
I think firstly, Mr. Putin will show again, his confidence to take some more, leading role in Syria situation, and also he will try to emphasize again the importance of the cooperation between Russia and Turkey and some other regional powers.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to this edition of Dialogue on the assassination of a Russian ambassador to Ankara and what's going to happen in Syria. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.